Lucas Reynolds never believed in legends. The small town of Elkwood, Vermont, where he had spent all his life, was full of them. Stories whispered in dark corners of old diners or during campfires deep in the woods. Ghost tales, monstrous creatures, and unexplained disappearances. But Lucas, he always dismissed them. After all, wasn't it all just a way for the older folks to scare children into behaving, or for teenagers to spice up their otherwise quiet lives? Elkwood, though picturesque in the daylight with its wooden houses and cobblestone streets, took on a different presence at night. The ancient oak trees that lined the town cast long, jagged shadows across the roads. The dense fog rolled in from the forest like a slow-moving blanket, swallowing everything in its path. The silence in those moments was thick, almost suffocating, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Lucas had grown up with that eerie stillness. The darkness of Elkwood's nights no longer unnerved him like it did when he was a kid. Back then, his mother would hold his hand tightly while they walked home after late errands, and she'd tell him that the forest was alive with secrets. Words he never fully understood, but always gave him chills. He used to ask her why she spoke of it that way, but her smile never quite reached her eyes when she answered. That was before the accident, before she died on that winding road through the woods when he was just 8 years old. Ever since that day, Lucas made it a point to avoid that road, especially at night. But tonight, he didn't have much of a choice. The night was colder than usual for late spring. Lucas shivered as he walked to his car after his shift at the local diner. His friend Ethan, always the jokester, was talking about some new horror movie he wanted to watch, but Lucas's mind was elsewhere. He had to drive home, back to the old family house, past the winding road that stretched beyond Elkwood, the road that cut right through the edge of the forest, the same road where his mother had her accident. "You're zoning out again, man." Ethan's voice pulled him back. "You good?" "Yeah," Lucas muttered, rubbing his arms against the cold. "Just tired, I guess." "Hey," Ethan grinned, "don't let the ghosts of Elkwood get to you." Lucas smirked, shaking his head. "You know I don't believe in that crap." They said their goodbyes, and soon, Lucas was alone. The diner lights flickered behind him, casting long, faint shadows across the gravel parking lot. He stood by his car for a moment, staring out toward the dark line of trees on the horizon. There was something about the stillness tonight that made him uneasy, like the quiet before a storm. Shaking off the feeling, Lucas got into his car and started the engine. The familiar hum filled the silence, a comforting sound against the encroaching night. He backed out, glancing at the road ahead. Long, empty, stretching out into the distance, a narrow ribbon between the towering trees. There wasn't another car in sight, just the soft glow of his headlights cutting through the mist that had begun to settle on the ground. As he drove, the road became more secluded. The houses disappeared, and soon, it was just him and the trees. Their dark shapes seemed to close in, leaning over the road like silent sentinels. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He told himself it was just the cold, or maybe the fatigue from the long shift. But a familiar unease began to creep in. Then he saw it. The old wooden gate that marked the edge of the forest road, the portera, as the locals called it. It was a relic from decades past, an ancient boundary marker where the road narrowed into a rough dirt path. Few people used it anymore, especially at night. Lucas had passed it many times, never giving it much thought. But tonight, as his headlights hit the old, weathered wood, something felt different. He slowed down, eyes narrowing at the gate as it came into view. It swayed slightly in the breeze, creaking as if it had a life of its own. And then, faintly, through the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under his tires, he heard something, a sound so soft, so fragile, that at first he thought he was imagining it, a cry. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. He eased off the gas pedal, letting the car coast 2 yards from the gate. He strained to listen, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The cry soft, pitiful, like the sound of a child sobbing. He looked around, there was no one in sight. The road behind him was empty, the woods dark and still. His pulse quickened, and for the first time in years, he felt the same cold dread that used to haunt him as a boy. It wasn't possible. There was no one out here. It had to be the wind, or maybe an animal. But the crying grew louder. Closer. Lucas leaned forward, squinting into the foggy night. The gate was still swaying gently, and beyond it, just darkness. But the crying, it was unmistakable now. A child's voice, sobbing softly, as if lost and alone. Every instinct told him to drive away, to leave this strange moment behind. But something about the sound pulled at him. He felt his chest tighten as memories of his mother's accident came rushing back. Her voice, her laughter, and the way she always warned him about the woods. He shook his head, gripping the steering wheel harder, trying to force those memories away. But the crying continued, relentless. Lucas swallowed hard, glancing at the gate again. His breath fogged up the windshield as he sat there, frozen between curiosity and fear. Should he get out? Should he see if there was actually someone there? Suddenly, the crying stopped. Silence. Just the creak of the gate in the wind and the low hum of his car engine. Lucas's pulse pounded in his ears. His breath was shallow, his muscles tensed. He waited, listening, expecting the crying to start again, but there was nothing. Only the weight of the dark night pressing in on all sides. And then, through the silence, something else. A whisper, faint, but unmistakable. A single word, carried on the wind. His name. Lucas. His blood ran cold. His heart raced in his chest as he stared out into the dark, the fog swirling around the gate. There was no one there, nothing but shadows. But the voice had been real. He was sure of it, and it had called his name. Without another thought, Lucas slammed his foot down on the gas, the tires screeching as the car shot forward, leaving the gate, and whatever had been waiting there, behind. But even as the road stretched out ahead of him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed. For the next several days, Lucas couldn't shake the sound of the crying child from his mind. It clung to him like a shadow, creeping into his thoughts at every quiet moment, replaying in his dreams at night. He would wake in a cold sweat, the echo of the sobs still lingering in his ears. There was something deeply wrong with what he had heard on that lonely stretch of road near the gate, something that didn't fit into the neat, rational world he had always clung to. At first, he tried to ignore it, dismissing the experience as nothing more than his imagination running wild. He hadn't been sleeping well after all. Long shifts at the diner and the pressure of final exams were wearing him down. Maybe it was the fatigue or just a trick of the wind that night. But deep down, Lucas knew better. The way the air had thickened with that cold, unnatural silence before the crying started. The distinct voice that whispered his name. There was no explaining that away. He found himself avoiding the road altogether. Even in the daytime, the thought of driving past that gate made his skin crawl. But every detour he took to avoid it only reminded him of what had happened, as though the act of avoidance kept the memory alive, feeding it, making it stronger. One night, a few days later, Lucas found himself at the diner again, sitting across from Ethan after the last of the customers had gone home. The clock on the wall ticked away in the empty room, and the overhead lights buzzed faintly in the silence. They had finished cleaning up, and now Ethan was busy scrolling through his phone, not paying much attention. Lucas toyed with his cup of coffee, watching the steam rise and disappear into the air. He had tried not to think about it, but it was all consuming now. The need to talk to someone, anyone, was like a knot in his chest that wouldn't loosen. He took a deep breath and broke the silence. "Hey, Ethan. Have you ever heard of anything strange happening by the old gate? You know, that one out by the woods?" Ethan looked up from his phone, a quizzical expression crossing his face. "The gate? What? Like ghost stories or something?" He chuckled. "Man, this town is full of them. Which one are you talking about? I don't know, just things or seeing something that shouldn't be there." Lucas said, something I don't know, his hands light around the coffee mug. Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "There's a ton of stories about that road, dude. People say it's cursed or something, but that's just small-town folklore, right? Creepy old gate in the middle of nowhere, of course. People are going to make up stories about it." Lucas hesitated. He could feel the weight of what he was about to say pressing down on him, but there was no turning back now. "I heard something," Lucas said quietly. "The other night when I was driving home, I heard a kid crying." Ethan's grin faltered, his expression shifting from amusement to mild concern. "Wait, seriously? Like, A real kid? Lucas nodded slowly. Yeah, it was late, and there was no one around, but I heard it clear as day. A kid crying, like he was standing right next to the road. But when I looked, there was no one there. I stopped the car, and the sound it kept getting louder. Ethan frowned, leaning forward. And you didn't see anyone? No car? No houses nearby? No, nothing. Just the gate, the woods, and the fog. And then, right before I drove off, I heard something else. Lucas's voice dropped to a whisper, as though speaking the words aloud would give them power. It said my name. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Finally, Ethan shook his head, a half-nervous chuckle escaping his lips. That's some messed up shit, man. Maybe it was some prank or something, like a speaker hidden somewhere near the gate. People around here like to mess with drivers, especially on that road. Lucas shook his head, his eyes dark with the memory. No, it wasn't a prank. I know what I heard, Ethan. There was no one there, but that voice, it was real. For the first time since Lucas had started talking, Ethan didn't have a joke or sarcastic remark. He just sat there, staring at Lucas, clearly unsure of how to respond. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice lower, more serious than before. You know the story, right? About the gate and the kid? Lucas frowned. What story? Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. There's this old legend about the gate. It's been around for as long as anyone can remember. People say there's a ghost, a little boy who haunts that road. The story goes that he drowned in the lake up near the woods decades ago, and now his spirit is stuck here, crying for someone to find him. They say if you hear him crying, you're already cursed. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine, his pulse quickening at Ethan's words. He wanted to laugh, to brush it off as another ridiculous ghost story, but he couldn't. Not after what he had experienced. That's just a story, Lucas said, though his voice lacked the conviction he wanted it to have. Maybe, Ethan said, shrugging. But a lot of people around here believe it. My grandfather used to tell me that when people hear the boy crying, bad things happen afterward. Disappearances, accidents, people going crazy. No one knows why, but they say the boy's looking for something. Or someone. Lucas swallowed hard, his mind racing. It was just a legend. Just a stupid story meant to scare kids, but it felt too close to what had happened to him. The crying, the voice, the gate. There was no way it was all a coincidence. He stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a scrape against the tile floor. I've got to go, he muttered, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. Wait, Lucas, Ethan called after him. But Lucas was already halfway out the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them sitting in the diner, pretending everything was normal. Lucas spent the next few days combing through every piece of information he could find about the legend. He scoured old newspapers, library archives, and even went so far as to visit the town's historical society, where dusty records from decades past were kept in boxes no one had touched in years. The more he dug, the more unsettling the story became. There had been a boy named Tommy Miller, who had drowned in a small lake near the woods in 1974. He was only 8 years old at the time, and the official report said it had been a tragic accident. But there were rumors, whispers in the margins of the town's history about what really happened that day. Some said the boy had been pushed. Others said he had been left there intentionally, abandoned by his own family for reasons no one could ever quite explain. But the most disturbing part was the pattern. Over the years, multiple people had reported hearing strange sounds near the gate, crying, whispers, even laughter, and not all of them had lived to tell the tale. There were reports of disappearances, accidents, and suicides, all happening shortly after someone claimed to have heard the boy's cries. It was as though the gate marked a boundary, not just between the town and the woods, but between the living and the dead. Lucas's research became an obsession. He barely slept, spending hours poring over old documents, trying to make sense of the fragmented stories. His dreams were filled with the sound of that child's sobs. After another sleepless stretch, more exhausted Lucas found himself standing in front of the gate once again. The wind was cold, biting against his skin, and the fog hung low over the road like a shroud. The gate loomed in front of him, ancient and silent, as if waiting for him to make the first move. He stepped out of his car, his breath clouding in the air as he approached the old wooden structure. The world felt too quiet, too still, as though all of Elkwood was holding its breath, watching. He stood there for a long time, staring at the gate, half expecting to hear the crying again, but the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the faint creak of the gate as it swayed on its hinges. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what he was looking for, or what he expected to find, but something had drawn him back here. He needed to understand what was happening. Why him? Why now? As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A figure, small and pale, standing just beyond the gate, barely visible through the fog. Lucas froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just standing there, watching. His mind raced. Was this real? Was he seeing things? He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the figure remained. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the fog. Lucas stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking as he rushed back to the car. He slammed the door shut and peeled out, the tires skidding on the gravel as he sped away from the gate, his mind reeling. What the hell had he just seen? The next morning, Lucas sat in his room, staring at the wall, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear and confusion. He hadn't told anyone about what he had seen, partly because he wasn't sure anyone would believe him, and partly because he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He had gone back to the library that afternoon, desperate to find something, anything that could explain what was happening. But the more he searched, the more questions he had. That evening, Lucas sat down with Ethan again, this time determined to get some answers. "I saw something," Lucas said, his voice low, as they sat across from each other in the dimly lit diner. Ethan looked up from his plate, his expression serious. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, leaning in slightly. "By the gate," Lucas continued. "I went back there last night and I saw someone, a kid, just standing there in the fog, watching me. But then, he was gone." Ethan's face paled slightly, and he set down his fork. "You sure it wasn't just the fog playing tricks on you?" Lucas shook his head. "No, it was real. I know what I saw." Ethan leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. "Man, I don't know what to tell you. This whole thing, it's starting to freak me out. You really think this has something to do with the kid? The one from the legend?" "I don't know," Lucas said, his voice tight. "But there's something going on, and it's not just some stupid ghost story." Ethan was quiet for a long moment before he spoke again. "Look, Lucas, if you're serious about this, maybe there's someone else who could help." Lucas frowned. "Who?" "There's this old guy," Ethan said slowly. "Hendricks. He's lived in Elkwood his whole life, and he knows more about this town's history than anyone. If anyone knows what's really going on, it's him." Lucas nodded, his mind racing. It was worth a shot. If Hendricks could provide some answers, maybe he could finally put this whole thing to rest. Lucas found himself standing outside Hendricks's house later that evening. The old man's house was on the outskirts of town, nestled deep in the woods, far away from the main road. The house itself looked like it had been plucked from a different era, its wooden beams weathered and sagging, the windows dark and dust-covered. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing a hunched figure with sharp, piercing eyes. "Hendricks?" Lucas asked, his voice uncertain. The old man nodded, his gaze sharp and suspicious. "What do you want?" "I need to ask you about something," Lucas said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "About the gate and the boy." At the mention of the gate, Hendricks's eyes darkened. He stepped aside, motioning for Lucas to enter. The inside of the house was just as old and worn as the outside, filled with the smell of dust and the faint scent of burning wood. The furniture was sparse, and the walls were lined with faded photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings. Hendricks motioned for Lucas to sit, his eyes never leaving him. "I don't know what you've heard," Hendricks said, his voice gravelly. "But if you're here asking about that damn gate, you're in for more than you bargained for." Lucas leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" Hendricks's gaze was cold, his voice low as he spoke. "The boy, Tommy Miller. He didn't just drown. That's what they tell everyone, but it's not the whole story. That kid was left there, abandoned by his own parents. They did it on purpose." Lucas stared at him, disbelief washing over him. "What are you talking about?" Hendricks leaned in, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "There's something old in those woods, something that's been there long before Elkwood was even a town. Tommy's parents, they were part of it. They made a deal, a sacrifice, and the boy was the price. And now he's trapped there, crying for someone to bring him back. But the thing is, Lucas, once you hear him cry, you're part of the deal too." Lucas felt the blood drain from his face, his hands trembling in his lap. This couldn't be real. It was impossible. But the look in Hendrix's eyes told him otherwise. Lucas sat in his car, staring at the road ahead, his mind racing with the weight of Hendrix's words. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the misty path that led back toward the gate, toward the woods, toward the thing that had been waiting for him all along. The boy's cry, chilling voice that called his name, and now the revelation that his own name was tied to something ancient and insidious. It all pressed down on him, choking him with fear. But beneath that fear was something else, a strange determination. He couldn't explain it, but a part of him knew that he had to see this through. There was no going back to his old life, no pretending this wasn't happening. The crying boy wasn't just a legend anymore, it was real, and it wanted something from him. He had crossed a line, and now there was only one thing left to do. Face it. Lucas gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The engine idled quietly, as though the car too was waiting for his decision. His breath fogged up the windshield, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow, all the sounds outside fading into a dull hum. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The empty road behind him stretched into the blackness, disappearing into the fog. He could turn around, he could drive back to town, pretend none of this had ever happened. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't change anything. The crying would follow him, just as it had followed all the others who had heard it. No, he couldn't run from this. Lucas let out a slow breath, reached into his jacket, and pulled out the old yellowed map that Hendrix had given him. It was crude, hand-drawn, but it clearly marked the route through the woods, leading to the lake where Tommy Miller had died. Or had been left to die. The gate loomed ahead, barely visible through the fog, the same gate he had stopped at just days before. But now, it felt different. The night was still, unnaturally so. No wind, no rustling leaves, no creak of the old wood. Just silence, thick and suffocating. Lucas got out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked toward the gate. The air was colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones, wrapping around your lungs and squeezing tight. He paused for a moment at the gate, staring out into the dark expanse of trees beyond. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he knew that whatever it was, it had been waiting for him for a long time. Slowly, he pushed the gate open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. The path ahead was barely visible, swallowed by the darkness, but Lucas pressed on, the beam of his flashlight cutting a narrow swath through the mist. The woods were dense, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, twisting and curling in the dark. Every step he took seemed louder than it should have been, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot. But there was something else too, something just out of earshot, faint, like the distant rustle of fabric. He stopped, listening, but the sound disappeared. He kept walking. The further he went, the heavier the air became, thick with the weight of unseen eyes. He could feel them, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, watching, waiting. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to keep going, one step at a time. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, and up ahead Lucas could see the faint glimmer of water reflecting the beam of his flashlight. The lake, the place where it had all begun. He stood at the edge of the water, the surface calm and still, like a mirror. The fog hung low over the lake, swirling lazily in the moonlight, giving the whole scene an otherworldly quality. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Lucas took a deep breath, feeling the cold air sting his lungs. He didn't know what he was looking for, But he knew he had to find something. Something to explain the crying, the voice, the curse. "Tommy," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. Nothing, just silence. He stepped closer to the water's edge, the ground soft and muddy beneath his boots. His breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of the night pressing down on him. For a moment, he wondered if he was making a terrible mistake, if maybe this was all in his head, some twisted hallucination brought on by too many sleepless nights. But then, just as he was about to turn back, he heard it. The cry. It started soft, almost imperceptible, like the wind brushing through the trees, but it grew, slowly, steadily, until it filled the air, echoing across the lake. Lucas froze, his blood turning to ice. The sound was unmistakable, the same heart-wrenching sob he had heard that night on the road. He scanned the darkness frantically, his flashlight beam dancing across the trees, the water, the fog. But there was no one, no child, no figure, nothing. And yet, the crying continued. "Tommy?" Lucas called out, his voice shaking. "Is that you?" The crying stopped. For a long, terrifying moment, there was only silence. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Lucas saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees on the far side of the lake. Small, pale, unmoving. A boy. Lucas's heart leapt into his throat, his hand tightening around the flashlight. The boy didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. "Tommy," Lucas breathed, taking a step forward, his mind racing. But as soon as he moved, the boy was gone. Just like that. Vanishing into the fog, as though he had never been there at all. Lucas's pulse raced, his hands shaking as he stumbled back from the water's edge. His mind screamed at him to run, to leave this place behind and never look back. But something rooted him to the spot, something stronger than fear, a need for answers. "Why are you doing this?" Lucas shouted, his voice echoing across the lake. "What do you want from me?" The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, and then from the darkness, a voice, soft, cold, and filled with unspeakable sadness. "Help me." Lucas's blood turned to ice. The voice was close, too close. It wasn't coming from the trees or the lake, it was behind him. He spun around, the flashlight beam swinging wildly through the fog, but there was nothing. Just the empty woods and the suffocating darkness pressing in on all sides. "Help me!" The voice came again, softer this time, barely a whisper. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew he should run, that every instinct in his body was screaming for him to get out of there. But he couldn't move. He was frozen, paralyzed by the voice that seemed to wrap itself around his mind, pulling him deeper into the darkness. "Tommy, what do you want?" Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. The fog swirled around him, thickening, coiling like a living thing. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like claws. And then, slowly, the crying began again. It was louder this time, closer, filling the air with its mournful sound. Lucas clutched the flashlight, his knuckles white, as the sound grew and grew, until it felt like it was coming from inside his own head. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he pressed them against his ears, trying to block out the sound. But it was no use. The crying was everywhere, all around him, inside him. "Please," Lucas gasped, his voice breaking. "Make it stop." But the crying only grew louder, more desperate, until it was all he could hear, drowning out everything else. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Lucas blinked, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The world around him was still, the fog hanging thick in the air. For a moment he thought it was over, that whatever had been tormenting him had finally let him go. But then he felt it. A hand, cold, small, and impossibly real, resting on his shoulder. Lucas's heart nearly stopped in his chest. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He could feel the weight of the hand, the icy chill seeping through his jacket, into his skin. Slowly, as though in a trance, Lucas turned his head. And there, standing right behind him, was the boy. Tommy. His face was pale, his eyes wide and dark, filled with an ancient sadness that Lucas couldn't begin to comprehend. The boy's lips moved, but no sound came out. Only the echo of the crying, soft and distant, filled the air. Lucas stared, frozen in place, his mind reeling. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. But the boy was real. And he wasn't alone. From the fog, more figures began to emerge. Pale, ghostly shapes, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in sorrow and pain. Men, women, children, all of them staring at Lucas, their expressions filled with the same unspeakable grief. Lucas scrambled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The figures didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched, their silent presence more terrifying than any scream. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. Lucas was left alone in the clearing, the fog swirling around him like a living thing. The lake was still, the woods silent. But the feeling remained, that oppressive weight, that undeniable presence. Tommy's voice echoed in his mind, soft and cold. "Help me." Lucas staggered to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen, what he had just experienced. But nothing made sense anymore. He stumbled back toward the car, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to get out of here. He had to leave this place behind and never look back. But as he reached the gate, he heard it again. The crying. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It followed him, just as Hendrix had said it would. And Lucas knew, deep down, that no matter how far he ran, no matter how fast he drove, the boy's cry would never leave him. It was a part of him now, forever.